Our next speaker is Gary Dawson, who's the CEO of the Australian Food and Grocery Council. And of course, that council has been very heavily involved in the development of industry codes, particularly around the relationship between supermarkets and their suppliers. So I'm sure Gary will touch on some of those issues in his presentation. Thanks, Gary.
Well, thanks very much, Mick, for the introduction, and thanks for the invitation to speak here today. It's a great organisation, do great work, and it's a great turnout for this conference. I should start by saying that, curiously, I'm also the son of a farmer's daughter. And although my additional connection is that I benefited from an excellent education at an agricultural high school where pursuit of academic excellence and pursuit of a career in agriculture were never seen as in any way in conflict. But most of my career has been spent in the media and in politics, two professions where a lack of detailed knowledge about anything has never been an impediment to speaking with authority about everything. Fortunately today, this topic, competition policy and how we get the balance right, is something that in this job for the last 2.5 years I've really had to live and breathe. In fact, the very first day that I started in this job, I didn't front up to the office in Canberra. My first appointment was at Bella Vista in Sydney, out at Woolworths, meeting up with the senior executives of Woolworths, which sort of was is an indication of how much time we've spent trying to get some rationality into that retailer-supplier relationship. We do need to change the conversation and find solutions in that space, and I'll talk about some of that in a minute. First of all, though, just a quick state of the industry overview. You know, the Food and Grocery Council works on behalf of food and grocery manufacturers and suppliers. So basically anyone in between the farm gate and the retailer. We don't represent the retailers. We talk a lot to producer groups like the NFF and Pork and others, but our membership are in that space. It's a sizable sector of the economy, $114 billion in turnover, and about $90 billion of that is food and beverage. So food and beverage by far the biggest sector, biggest subsector. Around 300,000 direct jobs, and importantly 45% of those direct jobs are in rural and regional Australia. So it remains a major employer outside the major cities. $27 billion in exports, and exports are growing strongly. Substantially transformed food exports grew by around 13% last year. Just a reflection on some of the things Gary Helou had to say last night, which I thought were very topical and very relevant. We've spent a lot of time in the last couple of years that I've been in this job looking at ways to reorient the industry view towards that export opportunity. And it is related to the competition issues in the domestic market, that moving the domestic processing food and beverage industry towards less reliance on domestic customers, less reliance on Coles and Woolworths essentially, and having more diversification by looking at the options in export. $31 billion in value add, that's the contribution to GDP, and you know, more than 27,000 businesses. Most of those are micro businesses, but they range right up to the global food and beverage companies. It's a dynamic, competitive market, and I guess the key point here for this audience is that food and grocery processing is classified as part of the manufacturing sector. It's the biggest part of the manufacturing sector, about 1/3 of it, but it really sits at the intersection of agribusiness and advanced manufacturing. It's inextricably linked to Australia's agriculture sector. The largest share of agriculture production, around 38% according to ABARES, goes into food and beverage processing. That's a larger share than goes into export or direct to market. And for many agricultural commodities, it's either essential or desirable to process it close to source. And so the competitive advantage that the agricultural sector has is relevant to the food processing sector because of that adjacency, because of that strong linkage. Equally, the health of the food processing sector has an impact upstream into the agricultural sector. You know, when a major food processing plant shuts down, obviously there are immediate and big flow-on effects to local producers. And that's where I guess we come to the issue of competition policy and getting it right, because the viability of food and beverage processing sector is or should be vitally of interest to the agriculture sector. I just want to talk a bit today about principally those relationships between the retailers and the processors, because that's the space that we're predominantly in. Talk a bit about market power and what's referred to as the double agent problem, and also talk about the code of conduct that we've negotiated with major retailers and where that's up to, and just to explain a bit about that and how we see that as likely to make a difference. Key issue for the processing sector is competitiveness and profitability. Profitability is falling. When I took this job, we had a lot of, you were struck by the number of war stories and anecdotes about the difficulties in the sector. We didn't have a lot of hard data. As a result, we commissioned KPMG to undertake some extremely detailed financial analysis, and they've done this 2 years in succession, taking a sample of 18 food and grocery suppliers, quite a strong sample, an average turnover around $1 billion in each of those companies, so collectively quite a strong sample. Analysing costs, revenues, profits to give us real data about what's going on in the sector. And this is one of the charts they produce, which shows the falling away of profitability of Australian suppliers relative to their global peers on a like-for-like basis. Other analysts have taken that work and extended it, and this was some data that Morgan Stanley released a couple of weeks ago. Others, UBS and Macquarie, have done similar work, which again underlines this point. On their estimation, over the past 4 years, the profit pool shared by suppliers has dropped by 38% or around $2.3 billion. And at the same time, the major retailers have significantly increased their profitability, expressed as a share. The share of the profit pool shared by suppliers into the major supermarkets has dropped from 51% to 35%. Coles has doubled their share, and Woolworths has also increased their share of profit significantly, and the others are pretty much line ball. This is a significant and major shift in the profitability of the players within the food chain. And so it's no wonder that there's been such a dramatic impact right through the food chain. And even though overall turnover of the food and beverage processing sector has been remarkably stable and is growing again, underneath that there's considerable structural change going on. Principally, to strip out cost, and this is part of the analysis that KPMG produced for us, because at the same time as we've had that increased competitiveness at the retail level, of course, food and beverage processors have been crunched by things like the high dollar, rapid increases in energy costs coming on top of the world's highest manufacturing labour costs, and so forth. It's the combination of those effects. Obviously, a key response has been to try and strip out cost wherever possible, to automate, to reduce labour costs, and we heard Gary talk last night about the new plants he's built, but right across the food processing sector you're seeing automation to try and strip out labour cost, energy efficiency measures and so forth. And that's a summary there on cost of goods sold, or COGS. And then on operating expenses, similar, supply chain costs, marketing costs, sales. This has flowed through to innovation, it's flowed through to R&D. That decline in profitability, the crunch that's been experienced in competitiveness has impacted right across the board for food and grocery manufacturers. But even with that focus on stripping out cost, profitability has continued to fall, and that's the other part of this slide. This was the conclusion by KPMG. And the reason for that, and I'm getting it back to the competition issues, is what's called in our industry trade spend, which has exploded over the last 3 or 4 years. Trade spend, put simply, is what companies pay to retailers to keep their product on the shelf. And it's everything from the down discounts through to payments for positioning, payments to make up shortfalls in profit projections, payments to fund promotional campaigns. There's a great list of what comes under the broad term trade spend. KPMG concluded that trade spend is the key driver for the declining profit. Cost reductions have not been sufficient to sustain profitability. And they also found that, if you look on here, that notably the ability of the two major retailers to extract additional payments is considerable. It's an extra 5% of gross sales over and above other retailers. Now, trade spend has always been part of normal business relationships in the food and grocery space, but it has exploded in recent years, and so it has focused attention on some of the practices that have gone on, because in effect it transfers risk and cost onto suppliers for no return. And you might think, well, why on earth would suppliers agree to such payments? Why on earth would they agree to a request for these payments? Which of course takes us to the issue of the market power imbalance and the extent to which that power exercised by the two major supermarket chains in the highly concentrated Australian market represents the normal rough and tumble of competitive capitalism, or does it cross over into unconscionable conduct? And Rod has mentioned the work that the ACCC has done, which is very important work, and some of those cases are now in court. The Harper Review is also grappling with this issue of market power and possible changes to Section 46 to make it more practical, more relevant, I guess, from our point of view, and we're currently analysing those suggestions and feeding that feedback back to the review, and I'm assuming Sue will probably touch on some of that too. As well as the market power issue, there's what we refer to as the double agent issue, which is of growing concern. And essentially this is a simplified attempt to represent it, where under normal trading relationships, the supplier provides to the retailer information about price, information about product, about new innovations coming down the chain and so forth. The competition issue, we believe, arises is when a retailer with considerable market power seeking to grow their own private label offering shares that non-public information with a contract manufacturer in order to produce a product, say a copycat product, and be on the shelf at essentially the same time as the new product from supplier A. This information asymmetry becomes more acute the greater the impact of retailers' own brand products, and that is part of the growth strategy of both the major retailers. we think this does raise competition issues, and if not addressed, could be a powerful disincentive for innovation, and that in the long run, consumers will consequently lose choice and access to innovative new products. Now, of course, it's not all hand grenades at 50 paces. We've spent a lot of time re-engaging with the retailers and seeking to come up with solutions to some of these problems. And so I want to spend a bit of time just talking about industry codes and the food and grocery code of conduct that's been negotiated with the retailers. The Harper Review, I think, quite right, this is a quote from the Harper Review at the top there, quite rightly points out that codes of conduct play an important role under the Competition and Consumer Act by providing for a flexible regulatory framework to set norms of behaviour. And I think coming back to the topic here about getting the balance right, the key words there are flexible, that is, a lighter touch approach than mandated intervention, and norms of behaviour. That is, codes do not change the structure of the market, but they can influence the standards of behaviour that apply within the market. Just over 2 years ago, we sat down along with the NFF, with Coles and Woolworths, to see if we could negotiate an industry code that would improve trading relationships, given that background that I've just run through in terms of the issues around market power and so forth. Now, I just want to say a couple of things about the code as it turned out, because it started as pretty much literally one page of principles, of sort of motherhoody principles. It developed through last year. It was just over a year to negotiate, into quite a detailed document, and the intent was always that it should be a prescribed code. So under the Competition and Consumer Act, a voluntary code can be prescribed. That is, tabled as a regulation, tabled in Parliament as a regulation under the Act. A prescribed code is binding on signatories, and a breach of the code is a breach of the Act. And so it brings into play some of those enforcement and audit provisions that apply under the Act. To us, this was essential in order for the code to be meaningful and enforceable and to have teeth, to echo some of the things Rod had to say. The objectives of the code are fair dealing, without impinging on the rights of suppliers and retailers to negotiate freely, to improve transparency and certainty in commercial relationships, and to deliver a cultural change in behaviour, and that's in the long-term interests of consumers. We reached agreement with the retailers almost exactly a year ago. Along the way, the NFF pulled out of negotiations, and so the code that was agreed relates principally to the relationship between food and grocery manufacturers, processors and the retailers, but in actual fact it covers all suppliers into those retailers. So anyone who has a direct supply relationship into the retailers will be covered by the code. In the last 12 months, it's gone through the Treasury regulatory impact assessment process, reviewed by the Office of Parliamentary Counsel, redrafted, consistent with what was in the original, and through a public consultation process. And right now, literally this week, the final, I guess, there's still negotiation going on the fine detail of where the code will land, particularly in this area of getting the balance right between restrictions on unfair behaviour whilst retaining the flexibility for suppliers and retailers to negotiate. And I won't go through all of this, but we were satisfied at the end of the negotiation that it does address the behaviours that have caused great damage to many suppliers. It prohibits or tightly restricts retrospective or unilateral changes to contracts, payments for theft or wastage, payments for shelf positioning. It includes requirements to pay in a timely manner. It includes, with regard to private label there, requirements that confidential information provided by a supplier must only be used for the purpose for which it's provided, with the onus on the retailer to demonstrate they've put in place procedures to ensure this is the case. So it goes some way to addressing that double agent problem. Now, the Food and Grocery Code is certainly no panacea, and we've never seen it as such, but we believe it is a significant step towards creating a more certain trading environment, a more even playing field and fairer rules of engagement. And it complements, and this is, I guess, the point I'd finish up, it complements the actions that companies are taking themselves to really improve their own bargaining position. And they are things like looking to limit their exposure to the two major retailers by developing alternate channels to market. This is where the export strategy comes into play. Getting back to the basics of brand building and building brand loyalty, using data on brand loyalty to push back on some of the retailer claims. In some cases, or in many cases, aligning supply chains and business strategies with the retailers, so there's a cost to the retailer to change out of those arrangements. Speeding up the innovation cycle. I mean, consumer goods companies traditionally, their strength has been the ability to understand and respond quickly to shifts in consumer demand, and that remains at the core of their viability. Trading on provenance, and we've seen this with SPC and Simplot, trading much more explicitly around the Australianness of their product, and continuing to drive those productivity improvements, because it's not going back to the way it was 4 or 5 years ago, where price increases of 3, 4, 5% were routinely signed through every year. We've had 4 years of retail price deflation. We don't think that's going to change anytime soon. And so a range of strategies are needed to survive in this market. The code, we believe, is an adjunct to these actions. It is about getting the balance right, and it is about lighter touch regulation that moves behaviour in the right direction without excessively adding red tape or compliance costs. So, look, thanks again for the invitation to be here today.